There is a place in the galaxy where two of the most destructive forces in the known universe have been locked in a war of mutual annihilation for decades, where no human army marches, where no imperial banner flies, where the only sound is the endless thunder of biology against brutality. A place so soaked in violence that the very ground has been remade by it. A place where something was deliberately unleashed by a single human being in a desperate act of calculated madness that may ultimately doom billions. This is the story of the Octarius War. It is, in the simplest possible terms, the story of what happens when you try to solve one terrible problem by feeding it to another terrible problem. It is a story about hubris at the scale of star systems, about the nature of two species that seem almost cosmically designed to be each other's worst nightmare, and about a conflict that has been quietly reshaping the balance of power across the entire galaxy, while everyone else was too busy surviving their own disasters to pay proper attention. Sit back, get comfortable, because this one deserves to be told slowly. Part 1. The Galaxy at the Edge of Ruin. To understand why the Octarius War happened, you first have to understand the specific kind of despair that was spreading through the upper echelons of the Imperium in the closing decades of the 41st millennium. The Imperium of Man is, at any given moment in the far future, in the process of quietly falling apart. That much is simply baseline. There are always wars. There are always worlds burning. There is always a fresh threat cresting the horizon, another army gathering beyond the light of the Astronomicon, another crack spreading through the bureaucratic machinery that holds humanity's 10,000 worlds together. The Imperium does not thrive. It endures. Barely, and not without cost, but it endures. But the arrival of Hive Fleet Leviathan was something different. The Tyranids are, as a concept, among the most unsettling things the universe of Warhammer 40,000 has ever produced. They are not a civilization. They do not have goals the way an empire or a warlord has goals. They are, at their core, a biological process given incomprehensible scale. The Hive Mind, that unknowable collective consciousness which binds every Tyranid organism together, does not desire conquest or glory or revenge. It desires biomass. It is hunger given form. A vast, sentient eating machine that emerged from somewhere beyond the edge of the galaxy, drawn toward the rich feast of organic life that fills the Milky Way. The first hive fleets that struck the galaxy in the 41st millennium arrived from the eastern fringe. Hive Fleet Behemoth carved a path of devastation toward the Heart Worlds before being stopped, at enormous cost, at the Battle of Macragge. Then came Kraken, splintering into hundreds of tendrils that struck simultaneously across a wide front, a nightmare of diffuse advance that nearly overwhelmed the Imperium's ability to respond. Even shattered, even driven back, remnants of these fleets continued to haunt the eastern fringe for centuries afterward. But Leviathan was different from the start. Unlike its predecessors, it did not arrive from the east. It came from below. Leviathan skirted under the galactic rim itself, approaching from beneath the galactic plane and pushing upward through it. This was an invasion that bypassed every defensive position the Imperium had ever set up against Tyranid incursion. By the time anyone understood what was happening, worlds across a massive front were already dying, their last desperate astropathic messages swallowed by the shadow in the warp as the Hive Fleet advanced. In late 997 of the 41st millennium, contact began to fail across dozens of systems in Segmentum Tempestus. Then more, then more. Inquisitor Kryptman, the man who would eventually do what he did, conducted a vast astrotelepathic survey, a project that would become known as the Kryptman Census, and began mapping the silence. When the worlds that had stopped answering were plotted on a stellar chart, the pattern was unmistakable. Leviathan was not a single advancing front. It was a pair of enormous tendrils, each hundreds of light years from the other, encircling a vast pocket of space between them. Every world trapped between those jaws was already doomed. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible. Leviathan covered a broad front that stretched across the Ultima Segmentum, Segmentum Tempestus, and reached even toward the Segmentum Solar itself. One of those main tendrils, according to early projections, was on a trajectory toward Terra, toward the heart world of the Imperium itself. Now, whether that trajectory ever would have held is a matter of some scholarly debate. The Tyranids are not exactly predictable in their movements, and stopping one tendril did not guarantee the others would follow. But the panic this realization generated in the highest levels of Imperial command was very real. This was the most immense Tyranid assault the galaxy had ever seen, arriving from an unexpected direction, at a moment when the Imperium was already stretched thin. Something had to be done. Some radical answer had to be found, because conventional military response was already proving inadequate to stem the tide. That is the context in which Kryptman's plan took shape. But to understand Kryptman himself, and why he was willing to do what he did, you need to understand who he was and what he had seen. Because he was not a bureaucrat calculating acceptable losses at a comfortable distance. He was the man who had spent his life staring into the face of the Great Devourer, and he had learned through hard experience that the Tyranids could not be reasoned with, could not be appeased, could not be turned aside by anything short of destruction. And he had learned something else too, something that would color every decision he made from that point forward. He had seen what the Tyranids did to a world they consumed, and he had decided that preventing it was worth any price. Part 2. The man who started it all. Inquisitor Kryptman Fidus Kryptman was a member of the Ordo Xenos, that branch of the Inquisition dedicated to the study and elimination of alien threats. Over the course of his career, he had the distinction of discovering and cataloging a remarkable 82 alien species, and subsequently having every last one of them declared a threat to the Imperium and ordered destroyed. Even by inquisitorial standards, this was a man with a particular view of the universe. He was not the first human to encounter the Tyranids. That terrible distinction belongs to the personnel of a research station on a world called Tyran, the last transmissions of which describe something arriving from the void that no one had ever seen before. By the time Kryptman investigated what had happened to Tyran, there was nothing left. Not ruins, not wreckage, nothing. The world had been stripped of every gram of organic matter down to the bedrock. Even the bacteria was gone. Kryptman named the species after that first world they devoured. In doing so, he anchored himself to the horror of their arrival in a way that would define the rest of his life. From that moment, he dedicated himself to understanding the Tyranids, to finding ways to stop them, to buying the Imperium whatever time he could against the advance of the Great Devourer. He fought through the Tyrannic Wars. He advised commanders. He shared his extensive biological and tactical knowledge of Tyranid organisms with Space Marine captains and Imperial Guard generals alike, helping them find the specific weaknesses in the Hive Mind strategies, the vulnerabilities in Tyranid bioforms that training and preparation could exploit. When Hive Fleet Behemoth was finally broken at Macragge, Kryptman was not celebrating. He was already preparing for what came next. He understood that Behemoth had merely been the advanced tendril of something vastly larger, an outrider for a galaxy-crossing migration that the Imperium had barely begun to comprehend. As the decades passed and the Tyranid threat continued to evolve and advance, Kryptman's methods grew progressively more extreme. His colleagues in the Inquisition whispered about him. His solutions became solutions that other Inquisitors found difficult to endorse, the kind of approaches that required looking past the immediate horror at the larger arithmetic of survival. He proposed destroying the moon of Geist entirely, redirecting a Space Hulk's trajectory in the process. He advocated for exterminatus on populated worlds that lay in the path of the advancing fleet, not because they were lost, but because he wanted to deny the Tyranids the biomass of those billions of people. Better to kill your own than feed them to the swarm. This was the man the Inquisition eventually decided had gone too far. Kryptman was censured, stripped of his rank, declared extremis diabolicus, and cast out from the organization he had served for generations. The Inquisition agreed that his plan to depopulate entire star systems as a firebreak against the Tyranids was unacceptable, that the deaths of those billions of people could not be justified even by the scale of the threat he was responding to. They were probably right, technically. But Kryptman kept going anyway, because what the Inquisition never fully grasped, and what Kryptman understood in his bones, was that the Tyranids were an extinction-level threat, and no tool in the Imperium's arsenal was adequate to stop them. At least, no conventional tool. If you could not kill the Tyranids with soldiers and ships and orbital bombardment, if you could not outrun them and could not hide from them, then maybe, just maybe, you could direct them, like a river. You could not stop a river by standing in front of it, but you could dig a channel, could you not? This line of thinking was what eventually brought Kryptman to a very dark place. And from that dark place, staring at the maps of Leviathan's approach and doing the terrible mathematics of potential outcomes, he found himself looking at the Ork empire of Octarius. He began to think about what would happen if Leviathan hit that empire instead of the next cluster of human worlds. The plan that formed in his mind was audacious to the point of madness, ruthless to the point of monstrosity, and arguably logical in a way that the cold-blooded calculus of galactic survival sometimes produces. If you could not stop the Great Devourer, you could at least redirect its hunger. You could feed it something else, something that could fight back, something that, with any luck, would grind the Tyranids to nothing while preserving human lives. If you were Cryptoman, you could feed Leviathan the Orks. The plan required a lure, something to draw a tendril of Leviathan toward the Octarius sector and not let go. Cryptomen identified a specific tool for this: genestealers, Tyranid scout organisms sent ahead of the main fleet, which create a psychic beacon that draws the advancing Hive Mind toward where they have been seeded, a trail of breadcrumbs written in warp-resonant biological signal. To get those genestealers, he led Deathwatch kill teams into the caverns of a world called Carpathia. It was an extraordinarily dangerous operation. The Deathwatch are among the finest alien hunters in the Imperium, but genestealers in their native environment are extraordinarily lethal, and capturing them alive rather than simply killing them multiplied the risk considerably. The teams took heavy casualties. Cryptman himself may have been present during the assault, though accounts vary. What is certain is that when it was over, he had what he needed: a brood of living genestealers contained in a stasis field, kept alive and dormant in the most precarious possible way. From there, he waited for opportunity. An opportunity came in the form of a space hulk called the Perdition's Flame. Space hulks are among the most dangerous objects in the galaxy. They are vast conglomerations of ships, fused together over centuries by the strange energies of the warp, drifting through real space in irregular and unpredictable patterns. They emerge from the immaterium without warning, follow courses that can sometimes be roughly predicted, but never perfectly controlled, and they are absolute magnets for the attention of Orks, who regard a space hulk as an enormous treasure chest waiting to be looted. The Perdition's Flame was one such object, emerging from the warp on a trajectory that Cryptman had been watching closely. He destroyed the moon of Geist, deliberately. Using whatever resources he had at his disposal, he detonated Geist in a cataclysm violent enough to alter the gravitational dynamics of the local space, and in doing so, he nudged the trajectory of the Perdition's Flame. Just enough to redirect it toward the Octarius sector. Then he released the genestealers aboard it. He woke them from their stasis, planted them in the Hulk's dark corridors, and sent the whole thing drifting toward the largest Ork empire in the galaxy. It was, by any reasonable measure, a horrifying act. It was an act that cost the lives of a moon's worth of whatever inhabited Geist. It was an act that deliberately engineered the infection of an entire empire with genestealer broods, an infection that would eventually draw a Tyranid hive fleet down upon those worlds. And it was all done unilaterally by a single inquisitor who had already been stripped of his authority by the very organization that governed his kind. But Cryptmon believed it was necessary. He believed it was the only way. He believed that if Leviathan reached those next cluster of human worlds unimpeded, the outcome would be catastrophic on a scale that would dwarf whatever suffering he was about to cause to the Orks. Whether he was right is a question the galaxy is still trying to answer. If you are enjoying this story so far, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. It always means a lot to see how far these stories travel. And if you have not subscribed yet, consider doing that now. There is a lot more lore where this came from, and you would not want to miss it. Part 3. The Ork Empire of Octarius. Before the Perdition's Flame arrived, before the first genestealer crept out of a dark corridor into the surprised grasp of an Ork looter, the Octarius sector was already one of the most impressive concentrations of Ork power in the known galaxy. Let us spend a moment with that, because it is easy to underestimate what the phrase Ork Empire actually means in practical terms. The Ork Empire of Octarius was vast. Not vast in the way a few worlds controlled by a successful war boss might be vast, but genuinely large in galactic terms, stretching across the Octarius sector in a region of the Ultima Segmentum almost comparable in size to the great holdings of Ultramar. Dozens of worlds fell under its dominion. Hundreds of millions of Orks, possibly more, called it home. This was not a raiding party, or a temporary coalition held together by the personality of a single charismatic warlord. This was a functioning, if anarchic, alien empire, with its own internal hierarchies, its own culture of brutal competition, and its own ruling title, the Overfiend of Octarius. That title alone tells you something about how orc power works. The orcs do not have kings or emperors in the conventional sense. They have whoever is biggest, loudest, and most capable of beating everyone else into submission. A war boss rules his warband because his warband is afraid of him. A warlord commands multiple war bosses because they respect his capacity to end them if they get uppity. And the Overfiend of Octarius sat at the top of this fractal structure of violence-based hierarchy, having risen through layers of conquest to rule an empire that would have alarmed any human observer who stopped long enough to calculate its military potential. The holder of the title at the time Kryptman's plan came to fruition was a greenskin called Black Tooth. Not a lot of detailed biographical information survives about Black Tooth, as tends to be the case with orc leaders. You generally learn about them through what they do rather than who they are. What we know is that Black Tooth was powerful enough to hold the Overfiend title, which means he had fought and killed his way to the top of a hierarchy containing some of the most violent creatures in the galaxy. He was canny enough to respond to the initial Genestealer infestation by employing boss Zagstruk and his Vulture Squad, a unit of veteran Stormboys, to intercept and destroy it. And when the full weight of Hive Fleet Leviathan came bearing down on his empire, he did not try to run, or negotiate, or seek alliance. He launched a counter-invasion directly into the oncoming Hive Fleet. This is, characteristically, exactly what an orc would do. To understand why this matters, you need to understand a little of orc biology and psychology. Orcs are not simply aggressive. They are organisms literally constructed around the concept of warfare. At the most fundamental biological level, they are a fusion of animal and fungal life, probably engineered in the ancient past by a now-vanished species called the Old Ones as a warrior race for their wars against the Necron. Whatever their origin, the end result is a creature perfectly adapted to perpetual combat. They reproduce through spores. Throughout their lives, orcs constantly shed microscopic spores into the environment around them, and these spores settle into the soil and slowly give rise to new orcs. More significantly, at the moment of death, an orc releases a massive surge of these spores, millions of them, seeding the battlefield with the biological potential for future generations of greenskins. This is why you cannot cleanse an orc from a world with simple military force. You can kill every orc present and still return decades later to find feral tribes emerging from the wilderness, grown from the spores of the soldiers you killed in the last campaign. They also grow larger and more powerful through accumulated combat experience. An orc who fights constantly, who wins constantly, who pushes through challenge after challenge, grows physically. The most experienced orc war bosses are enormous, towering creatures that dwarf their own soldiers. And beyond the individual, there is another layer to this. The more orcs in a given area, the stronger the psychic pressure they collectively generate. Orcs are psychers without knowing it, their combined belligerence producing a field of energy that the Imperium calls the warp imprint, a kind of low-level collective psychic resonance that manifests in all sorts of strange ways. Their technology works because they believe it will work. Their bullets, by the laws of physics, should not function as well as they do, but somehow they do, because enough orcs believe they will. Concentration and combat make orcs stronger. More orcs in one place attract even more orcs, via a psychic signal that broadcasts across light years, drawing greenskins from distant worlds toward wherever the biggest fight is happening. A successful enough warlord does not just grow powerful himself. He becomes a focus point for a migration that can empty orc populations across entire sectors, drawing warriors from everywhere toward the growing mass of his gathering horde. This is what the orc empire of Octarius represented. It was an enormous, ancient, deeply entrenched concentration of greenskin military power, ruled by a warlord who had proven himself capable of holding it together. It was also, critically, geographically positioned in a way that made it interesting to someone like Kryptman. It sat between the advancing Tyranid tendrils and the next cluster of vulnerable human worlds. What Kryptman saw was a buffer, a horrifically dangerous, militarily formidable, essentially unconquerable buffer, composed of creatures that loved nothing more than a good fight and that reproduced faster when they were killing things. In his calculations, this was a resource, a terrible alien resource, but a resource nonetheless. What he could not fully account for was just how right he was about the Orks' capacity for warfare, and how badly that would ultimately complicate everything. Part 4. The trap is sprung. Genestealers, space hulks, and a moon destroyed when the Perdition's flame drifted into the outer reaches of the Octarius sector, carrying its hidden cargo of dormant Genestealers. The reaction of the local Orks was entirely predictable. They boarded it. Of course they did. A space hulk is, to any Ork who encounters one, the greatest possible treasure, an enormous mass of alien machinery, archaeotech, and mysterious salvage, all waiting to be picked apart by whoever is bold enough to venture inside. Lutaz, those Orks with a particular talent for identifying and acquiring valuable technology, were among the first to swarm the Perdition's flame in Thies boats and ramshackle vessels that passed for Ork space transports in this region. They did not know about the Genestealers. By the time they found out, it was already too late. Genestealers are, in the context of close-quarters combat in dark, confined spaces, among the most lethal individual organisms the Tyranids have ever produced. They are extraordinarily fast, possessed of multiple arms tipped with talons designed specifically to penetrate armor at close range, and they are clever in a way that many other Tyranid organisms are not, capable of coordinating ambushes and patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. A handful of them in the corridors of a space hulk is an almost insurmountable tactical problem. The Ork Lutaz who boarded the Perdition's flame were not hunting, they were exploring. They were moving through corridors that were half familiar and half alien, torches cutting through the dark, looking for machinery to strip. And then the Genestealers came for them, not to kill them. That is the terrifying part. Genestealers do not simply massacre the populations they encounter, they implant. A Genestealer that captures a host alive injects a genetic package into it, a sequence of modified biological instructions that slowly alters the host's genome over generations, building toward the eventual creation of hybrids and cultists that serve the Hive Mind's advance. The Lutaz who survived the initial assault aboard the Perdition's flame were not lucky. They were chosen. They were allowed to leave, carrying a biological legacy they could not feel and did not understand. When those Orks returned to the worlds of the Octarius Empire, they spread the infestation. Within weeks, Genestealer cults had taken root across the sector. By the time the Blood Axe warbosses realized something was wrong, by the time they employed Zagstruk and his Vulture squad to deal with it, the infection had already spread too far to be fully contained. Zagstruk's Storm Boys swept through and destroyed what they could find, winning a tactical victory while losing the strategic situation entirely, because the infestation had served its purpose. The psychic signal was already broadcasting. Somewhere in the dark between stars, the tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan turned. A Tyranid fleet in transit through the void is a vision that beggars description. Imagine thousands of vessels, each one a living organism grown from a template of biological perfection, propelled through space by drives that are as much organs as engines. These are not ships in any conventional sense. They breathe, they metabolize, they communicate through biochemical signaling cascades as complex as any electronic network, and they move with a terrible sense of purpose, guided by the Hive Mind toward the source of that psychic signal, that Genestealer breadcrumb trail that says here is where your children have gone ahead, here is where the prey awaits. The tendril did not wait for Zagstruk to finish his work. It was already close. It had been moving before the infestation was fully contained, redirected toward the Octarius sector by the signal Kryptman had seeded. And once a Tyranid fleet has set its course toward a source of prey, only complete destruction of that fleet can turn it aside. The Overfiend Blacktooth received word that a dozen worlds in the outer reaches of his empire had been infected within weeks of the fleet's arrival. He did not hesitate. He did not call councils or weigh his options. He assembled the biggest force he could put together and launched it directly at the incoming Tyranids. That is what Orks do. You do not sit in your fortress and wait for trouble to come to you. You go out and you hit it first, hit it hard, and you do not stop hitting until one of you is dead. It was, in retrospect, exactly the right instinct, and exactly the wrong assumption about what kind of opponent he was dealing with, because the Tyranids do not respond to a charge the way an enemy with pride responds. They do not break from audacity. They do not flinch from numbers. They adapt. Part 5. First Blood, Orok and Gorala. The first worlds to truly experience the full weight of what was coming were the outer worlds of the Octarius Empire, and the way those battles unfolded tells you almost everything you need to know about the fundamental character of this war. Orok was a former imperial world, long since absorbed into the Greenskin Empire, its surface now a rough patchwork of Ork settlements and fortifications, built with characteristic haphazard enthusiasm on the bones of whatever was there before. When the skies above Orok darkened, the Orks looked up. What they saw was mycetic spores descending in their millions. Mycetic spores are the Tyranid equivalent of a drop pod, living organisms the size of small houses, each one carrying a payload of Tyranid creatures inside it. They fall from orbit with tremendous force and split open on impact to disgorge whatever the Hive Mind has decided that particular landing requires. A sky full of mycetic spores is one of the most terrifying things a planetary defender can see, because it means the Tyranids are coming, and they are coming everywhere at once, not at any single point you can reinforce or concentrate your defense against. The Orks of Orok heard the impacts across the horizon, and they ran toward them. This is not metaphor. Ork instinct when something violent happens nearby is not to take cover. It is to find out if there is a fight, and if there is, to get into it immediately. Thousands of Ork boys charging across the open plains of Orok toward the landing zones, weapons raised, making the kind of noise a mob of warriors makes when it is genuinely thrilled about what is happening. The first waves of Tyranid organisms that emerged from the broken spores were met with that charge, and the collision was savage on both sides. Gaunts against boys, Carnifexes against war bosses, Squigs and Rippers tearing at each other underfoot, two's alien ecosystems in violent collision. Even at the microscopic level, Tyranid phage cells consumed Orkoid spores, and Ork biology clashed with Tyranid biology in a war that was playing out simultaneously at every imaginable scale. For a while, it seemed like the Orks might hold. Orok had a large population. The Orks were fighting on home ground, in terrain they knew, with the kind of berserk fury that is simultaneously terrifying to face and difficult to coordinate against. But the Tyranids had done their calculation before the spores fell. They had not come with just enough to win. They had come with enough to guarantee it. The Orks began to realize, as the hours passed, and the fighting went on, and the waves of Tyranid organisms kept coming, that they were outnumbered, not by a little, by an enormous margin. The Hive Mind had committed sufficient biomass to Orok to ensure the outcome, and as the sun set on that first day of battle, every Ork on the planet was still fighting. By the time that sun rose again, every Ork on Orok was dead. Their corpses became bioresources. The Tyranid digestion pools processed them, breaking down the organic matter into a form the Hive Fleet could use, feeding the growing swarm with the raw material of the creatures it had just consumed. Orok was stripped, its Ork population adding its biology to the gene pool of Hive Fleet Leviathan. The next world to face the swarm was Gorala, and here the story becomes considerably more interesting. Gorala was the base of a figure known as Pirate War Boss Scar Fang, who commanded the Scar Fleet, a naval force that was, by any objective measure, formidable enough to give any Imperial Admiral serious pause. When Leviathan arrived at Gorala, Scarfang was ready for it, in the way Orks are ready for things, with the biggest guns he had available, surrounded by every Ork vessel within a dozen light years, and a minefield hidden in the local asteroid belt that had apparently been there for some time, waiting for exactly this kind of occasion. What happened in orbit above Gorala was, by all accounts, extraordinarily violent. The Tyranid fleet came in and hit that minefield, and cataclysmic explosions tore apart bioships that had no idea the mines were there. The surviving vessels barely had time to react before Scarfang's gunships were on them, hammering the living hulls with ordnance at close range. The Tyranid fleet at Gorala was, for that brief moment, actually losing. But the Hive Mind does not process defeat the way a thinking individual does. It does not have pride to wound or morale to break. When a Tyranid fleet is losing in space, it simply does what the mathematics of the situation indicate it should do. One bioship, the last one, threw itself at the planet's surface, regardless of the fire being poured into it from every direction. It absorbed the damage, it kept moving, and before it finally died, it launched thousands of mycetic spores into Gorala's equatorial plains. Scarfang, watching from orbit, understood immediately The space battle was won. The real fight was now on the ground. He made planetfall. His forces descended to meet the swarm. And for a while, the battle on Gorala went well for the Orks, because this time, the Tyranids were badly outnumbered. The swarm that had landed from that single desperate bioship was small compared to the Ork population of Gorala. Every calculation the Tyranids ran told them that a direct fight of attrition ended in their destruction. So, they changed their approach. The Tyranids stopped fighting head-on. They started hunting synapse creatures, those larger Tyranid organisms that serve as conduits for the Hive Mind's will, keeping lesser beasts coordinated and directed, coordinated the swarm into something that looked almost like guerrilla warfare. Small units, hit and fade, engaging only isolated Ork patrols where the odds were favorable. When the Orks began moving in groups large enough to overwhelm any small-scale ambush, the Tyranids shifted tactics again, seeking larger engagements where they could cause maximum casualties before retreating. When overwhelmed, they disappeared into caves and underground passages, regrowing in the dark, while synapse creatures pulled the scattered organisms back together and fed them on the bodies of the dead. Ork dead and Tyranid dead both, processed in digestion pools, hidden in the rocky mesas of Gorala's highlands. Slowly, the swarm grew. As it grew, it sought larger and larger Ork concentrations to fight, winning more biomass, growing larger still. The feedback loop was already beginning, even at this small scale. Scarfang was not a fool. He recognized that the swarm was growing, that his forces were being ground down by attrition, even when they won individual engagements. He threw himself into the fighting personally, and for a time, the raw charisma and belligerence of a powerful war boss on the battlefield was enough to tip local engagements in the Orks' favor. There is a real phenomenon here, rooted in Ork psychology. When a genuinely impressive war boss fights alongside his troops, the collective belief of the surrounding Orks surges, and they fight harder and more effectively than they otherwise would. Scarfang's presence rallied his boys and pushed the Tyranids back. So, the Hive Mind decided to kill Scarfang specifically. The plan was elegant in its cold precision. The Tyranids began feinting, throwing waves of hormagaunts at Ork defensive lines and then withdrawing before the Orks could respond properly. This was not an accident. This was bait, repeated over and over from different directions until Scarfang's frustration reached its limit. On the 10th such attack, after watching his lines roused to defend against a charge that once again simply dissolved into the darkness before contact, Scarfang made the decision that cost him his life. He ordered a pursuit. Battle wagons and war trucks bellowed after the retreating swarm, directly into a prepared kill zone. Venomthropes surrounded the convoy in a thick toxic fog, and in the choking murk, vehicles crashed into rocky outcrops, into each other, into anything they could no longer see. As the Orks staggered out of their disabled transports, gasping and disoriented, lictors came for them one at a time. Lictors, those nightmarish stalker organisms that can hide in plain sight, clinging to surfaces and waiting in stillness for hours until the perfect moment, had positioned themselves throughout the kill zone before the fog descended. Each Ork was isolated, confused, already struggling to breathe. Each was taken individually until the entire convoy was gone. Scarfang was the last one left. He had killed the Venomthropes with his bare hands, raging through the dying fog, and when it cleared, he found himself surrounded by lictors in every direction. He took 2 steps toward the nearest one before a dozen sets of claws tore him apart. With their war boss dead, the Orks of Gorala did exactly what Orks always do when the big boss falls. They started fighting each other for dominance. Each tribe isolated itself from the others, infighting, preventing any coordinated response. And the Tyranids, patient, systematic, possessed of absolute coordination from a hive mind that never second-guessed itself, picked them off one tribe at a time until there were none left. Gorala's biomass was processed and turned into new bioships. The Tyranid infestation spread to nearby worlds. The pattern that had consumed Orok was repeating, and it would keep repeating across the outer worlds of the Octarius Empire until it reached the center, until it reached Octarius itself. Part 6, The Battle for Octarius. Where the war truly began. The central world of the Empire, Octarius, is where this conflict stopped being a series of disastrous losses and became something much more complicated. Something that, in a dark sense, both sides were almost built for. When Blacktooth received word of what had happened at Orok and Garala, he did not spend long in denial. He marshaled the tribes. He prepared defenses with all the chaotic energy that Ork preparation involves, which meant that within days, the main world of Octarius was festooned with quad guns, flakadaka guns, and every anti-air weapon that could be constructed, scavenged, or violently repurposed from something else. Hundreds of thousands of Orks were arrayed across the planet's surface in a state of barely contained excitement. The word had spread. Something big was coming, something worth fighting. The first wave of mycetic spores arrived in the sky above Octarius, and the great cheer that went up from the assembled Ork hordes was audible for miles. They were ready for this. More than ready. They had been waiting for this. So much ammunition was fired upward at the descending spores that the rain itself was thickened with chunks of falling Tyranid flesh. The Ork quad guns hammered the sky relentlessly, and for every spore that got through, 5 were destroyed before they could land. The sky above Octarius looked like a thunderstorm made of fire and alien ichor. Then, from the western horizon, what seemed at first like storm clouds gathered and moved, too fast, too coherent. These were gargoyles, thousands of them, winged Tyranid organisms that moved in coordinated swarms, each one a predatory creature capable of tearing an Ork apart with its taloned limbs and dissolving bioacid. The Ork Defcoptas and Phytobombers screamed into the air to meet them, and the battle spread across the sky in a vast three-dimensional slaughter, burning wreckage and hissing Tyranid ichor, raining down on the boys below, who were desperately clawing the ground to try and jump into the fight overhead. Then the ground itself opened up. Genestealer broods burst from tunnels they had been quietly digging for weeks, emerging in the midst of Ork defensive positions. They were driven back into their tunnels, and the Orks plunged in after them, disappearing underground into a whole separate, lightless war playing out in the caves and passages beneath the surface of the planet. While this was happening, lictors were scaling the mountainsides, silencing each Ork gun emplacement one by one in the dark. With the big guns down, the mycetic spore rain doubled. And as the Orks responded to the spores, they found themselves facing ever-growing numbers as the fighting on Octarius began drawing the broader escalation of the war. The Hive Mind, having established a foothold, committed more resources, and the Orks, fired up by the greatest fight they had ever seen, began calling to their kin across the sector and beyond. Octarius had never seen bloodshed on this scale. The surface became a churning battlefield, where the fighting never fully stopped, where neither side could achieve the kind of decisive victory that ends a war, because both sides were continuously receiving reinforcements and both sides were continuously growing from the conflict itself. This is where the Octarius War truly began. Not on Orok or Garala, where Tyranid efficiency had simply overwhelmed Ork resistance, but here, on the Central World, where something more complex was emerging from the collision of these two organisms. Something that nobody had predicted, not Cryptman, not Blacktooth, not the Hive Mind itself, though the Hive Mind would eventually come to see it very clearly. The war was not consuming both sides, it was feeding them. Part 7. The Feedback Loop, How Both Species Became Monsters. This is the part of the story that transforms the Octarius War from a dramatic conflict into a genuine galactic catastrophe. Consider what happens to an Ork in battle. Not just the psychology of it, though the psychology matters. The way victory builds confidence, builds aggression, builds more victory, a positive feedback loop of belligerent energy. But the actual biology. Orks that fight and win grow larger. Orks in proximity to large numbers of other fighting Orks are enhanced by the collective psychic field they generate. A concentration of Orks that is drawn into sustained, brutal combat over months and years becomes something categorically different from the individual Orks that went into it. They are bigger, their skin is tougher, their reactions are faster. Their weapons, guided by that strange psychic certainty Orks have about technology working, perform better than they have any right to. And more Orks kept coming. From light years away, the psychic resonance of the Octarius War, this enormous sustained battle that was, objectively, the most exciting thing happening anywhere in the galaxy for any Ork, was broadcasting across space like a beacon. Orks from distant worlds began drifting toward Octarius, drawn by an instinct they could not name toward the sound and sense of a truly magnificent fight. Ships crammed with greenskins arrived in the Octarius sector in increasing numbers. Tribes that had nothing to do with the Empire showed up because they heard there was something worth fighting, and they wanted in. Every one of them arrived, and immediately found something to fight. And every one of them, in fighting and dying, released spores into the soil of those worlds. The Ork population of the Octarius sector was in a state of continuous renewal and growth, the dead replaced by new generations bred from the spores of the fallen, the survivors growing larger and more capable. The Ork Empire, rather than being diminished by the war, was actually expanding in terms of raw military potential. The Tyranids had come to consume it, and instead they had accidentally created conditions for it to grow. Now consider what was happening to the Tyranids. The Hive Mind's central function is consumption and adaptation. It takes in biomass, organic matter, genetic material, the biological complexity of every creature it defeats, and integrates that material into its gene pool. New organisms can be designed using genetic material acquired from prey species. Tyranid bioforms that were struggling against a particular type of enemy can be redesigned, incorporating elements of that enemy's biology to overcome its strengths. The Hive Mind is not just an army, it is an evolving weapons program with an essentially infinite design budget, paid for in the bodies of its enemies. And its enemies, at Octarius, were Orks. Ork biology is extraordinary. At the cellular level, Orks incorporate fungal genetics that make them extraordinarily resistant to toxins, infections, and environmental stress. Their symbiotic relationship with the fungus that grows throughout their bodies gives them a physical resilience that borders on absurd. Orks can survive wounds that would kill anything else, can reattach severed limbs under the right circumstances, can keep fighting through injuries that would put any human being into shock long before the actual dying part. Their musculoskeletal structure is built for sustained combat. Their immune systems, such as they are essentially indestructible. When the Tyranids consumed Ork biomass at Octarius, they were getting access to all of that. Tyranid organisms evolved, over the course of the war, to incorporate elements of what they were eating. Gaunt-type organisms developed resilience they had not previously possessed. Carnifexes became harder to kill. Bioweapons developed new properties. The Hive Mind was doing what it always does, learning from its prey, incorporating the best parts of its enemy's biology, and at Octarius, it had access to what might be the single most durable biological design the galaxy had ever produced. Imperial scholars watching from what they hoped was a safe distance began to speculate in increasingly alarmed tones about what this meant. If the Tyranids emerged from the Octarius War with Ork-derived adaptations fully incorporated into their design templates, they would be bringing a combination that no one had encountered before: the coordination and psychic suppression capabilities of the Hive Mind, paired with the physical resilience and rapid reproduction of Ork biology. This was not a theoretical concern. This was a measurable ongoing development, visible in the bioforms being encountered in battle, even in the relatively early phases of the conflict. The feedback loop had two directions, and both of them were bad. Every Ork killed fed the Tyranids and made them stronger. Every Tyranid killed attracted more Orks and made them stronger. Every passing month meant both armies were larger, more capable, and more dangerous than they had been the month before. The war was not consuming either side. It was forging them, the way a good blacksmith uses controlled violence to make metal harder. Kripman's plan had been to throw these two species at each other and watch them grind one another to dust. What was actually happening was closer to the opposite. He had taken two of the galaxy's most formidable military forces and put them in a situation where both would emerge from the fight significantly enhanced. The Imperium was not going to inherit a galaxy swept clean of both threats. The Imperium was going to eventually face either a Tyranid swarm supercharged with Ork-derived genetics, or an Ork horde swollen to unprecedented size, and battle-hardened on a diet of fighting the Great Devourer, or possibly both. Even Kripman, presumably watching from exile, must have understood at some point that this was not going the way he had intended. The war escalated. It spread from the central world outward through the sector. Dozens of individual planetary battles were fought, each one a grinding affair that could last weeks or months. Ork command structure, such as it ever was, became increasingly difficult to maintain as the scale of the conflict outgrew any single warlord's ability to coordinate. The Tyranids, guided by the Hive Mind's perfect coordination, could adapt their strategy from battle to battle in ways that individual Ork war bosses simply could not anticipate. By 997 of the 41st millennium, the Imperial Inquisition had concluded that the war in Octarius was not going to resolve itself cleanly. Something needed to be done to contain what was happening there, because the other terrifying possibility, one that kept Imperial strategists awake, was that eventually, one side or the other would win, and the winner would emerge from that cauldron of sustained warfare as the most dangerous military force in the galaxy. Part 8. Gaz-Kul arrives. The prophet of the greenskin gods, in the year 694.999 of the 41st millennium, a signal started moving through Ork networks across that region of the galaxy. Not an explicit communication. Orks do not typically communicate through anything as refined as explicit messages, but a feeling, a resonance, a psychic certainty that something important was happening, and that any Ork with any sense of self-preservation, or more accurately, any sense of where the good fighting was, should pay attention. Gaz-Kul Magurak Thraka was coming to Octarius. The name alone deserves a moment of consideration, because Gaz-Kul is not simply a powerful warlord. He is, in the cosmology of 40th millennium Ork culture, something approaching a prophet. He was not born to greatness. He started as a lowly Ork boy on a world called Urk, and the earliest record of him is from 9 years before the Second War for Armageddon, when a Space Marine force raided that world. What happened during that war transformed Gaz-Kul from an unremarkable green skin into something the Imperium would spend the next century trying and failing to kill. During the fighting, a bolt round tore into Gaz-Kul's skull, destroying a significant portion of his brain. What should have killed him instead passed him to the hands of a pain boy, a kind of Ork surgeon mad scientist hybrid, named Mad Doc Grotznik, who rebuilt the shattered portions of his skull with adamantium. What emerged from that surgery was fundamentally different from what went in. Gaz-Kul began to hear the voices of Gork and Mork, the twin Ork gods. He became convinced, with absolute certainty, that he was their chosen instrument, their prophet. Whether this was the result of the surgery, some genuine divine intervention in the warp, or simply a particularly aggressive manifestation of Ork psychic ability amplified by the adaptive metal now wired into his brain, no one can definitively say. What is certain is that the belief was real to Gaz-Kul, and more importantly, it was real to every Ork who encountered him. There is something about genuine conviction, especially when it is backed by the ability to rip a tank apart with your hands, that tends to be persuasive. He fought in the Second War for Armageddon, demonstrating tactical intelligence that Ork warlords simply were not supposed to possess. He fought in the Third War for Armageddon, returning 57 years later with an even larger force, taking half the planet's surface before the conflict ground into stalemate. And then, to the great confusion of everyone, he simply left. Not because he lost, not because he was driven off. He became bored. This is perhaps the most Ork thing that has ever happened in the history of the galaxy. Gaz-Kul left Armageddon because the fight had stopped being interesting. He left his generals to deal with the ongoing campaign and departed in search of something more exciting. What followed was the Battle of Haunted Gulf, where he was cornered by the Black Templars and Commissar Yarrick, and where, in the heat of that battle, his weird boys spoke with voices that were not their own. The message was clear, even through the screaming and the fire. It was not his time to die. The whole galaxy must echo with the sound of the Orks in battle. He was to gather a war host that had never been seen before, defeating every major Ork warlord and bringing their forces under his command, and then lead them in a battle that would last forever. His ship disappeared into the warp. It reappeared in the Octarius sector. The state of the Ork forces in Octarius at that point was precarious. Black Tuv, the original Overfiend, was deeply embroiled in the war. A warlord named Gorsnik Magash had held the Overfiend title at some point, but had departed for Armageddon when the chance to fight in that war became too attractive to pass up. In his absence, a Death Skull warlord named Zog Steel Toof had risen to fill the power vacuum, but his rule was unstable, in the way all Ork leadership becomes unstable when the boss is clearly losing ground. The war was not going well in the strategic sense, even if individual battles were still being won. The Tyranids were adapting faster than the Orks could respond to their adaptations. The Hive Mind's patient, methodical approach was slowly grinding down the Empire's ability to coordinate resistance. And then Gaz-Kul arrived, and something changed. He did not come as a guest or an ally. He came as the prophet with fire and purpose, and his first significant act was to kill a Moloch in single combat. Molochs are enormous Tyranid organisms, designed for tunneling through solid rock and bursting through the ground beneath enemy formations. Creatures the size of small buildings, armored in dense chitin, possessed of a killing power that can turn an entire unit of Space Marines into nothing in seconds. Killing one in a direct fight requires either exceptional firepower or exceptional individual combat ability. Khaz-Khul killed it with his hands, or close enough to his hands that the distinction barely matters. The effect on the Ork forces around him was immediate and dramatic. This is the thing about Ork psychology and the psychic field that underlies it. When an Ork does something genuinely extraordinary, when a warlord demonstrates the kind of power that feels like something the gods themselves have sanctioned, the energy of the surrounding Orks surges. They fight harder. They believe harder. They push through situations that would have broken them 5 minutes before. Khaz-Khul's arrival at Octarius was not simply the addition of one more powerful warlord to an existing command structure. It was a reset, a rekindling of the Ork warfire that the grinding attrition had been slowly smothering. Zog Steel-Tooth, recognizing which way things were going, fell in line. The remaining war bosses fell in line, and Khaz-Khul, channeling the mandate he believed he had received from Gork and Mork, reorganized the Ork war effort with a clarity of purpose that the Greenskins had been lacking. He drove across the surface of Octarius itself and wiped it clean of Tyranids. Every single Tyranid organism on that world was destroyed. The planet briefly, temporarily, cleansed of the swarm's presence. Knowing that he had shown the Orks of the sector what was possible, that he had reminded them what winning felt like, Khaz-Khul did something that surprised everyone. He left. He had done what he came to do. He had reinvigorated the Ork cause. He had proclaimed that this was a war for Gork and Mork, that every Ork who died here died in service to the divine fight the gods had ordained. And now he had a larger mission. The Great Waj needed to be assembled. Every major Ork warlord in the galaxy needed to be brought under his banner. Octarius was one stop on a much longer journey. Behind him, he left an Octarius that was changed. More Orks than ever were streaming toward the sector, drawn by the presence of Khaz-Khul's legend even after his departure. The war was burning hotter than it had before. And ahead of him, Khaz-Khul was reportedly leading an armada, an almost incomprehensible armada of 5 million warships, toward the Imperium. 5 million. The Imperium, wisely, began to consider the possibility that they had very serious problems in multiple directions simultaneously. Part 9. The Swarmlord Descends. The Hive Mind's Final Answer. For a period after Khaz-Khul's reinvigoration of the Ork cause, the Octarius War was at something of a strategic impasse. The Orks were fighting harder, coordinating better, and had reclaimed something of the battle momentum they had been losing. The Tyranids were adapting continuously, growing from the Ork biomass they consumed, designing new organisms to counter the tactics being deployed against them. Both sides were stronger than they had been at the start. Neither was close to winning. The Hive Mind considered this situation with the kind of patience that an entity unbounded by individual mortality can bring to a problem. It could afford to wait. It could afford to experiment, to try approaches and discard them when they did not work, to build toward a solution methodically over the course of years. It had done exactly this throughout the history of its encounters with various species. Against the Imperium, against the Tau, against the Eldar, the Hive Mind had shown the same capacity for strategic patience, the willingness to absorb enormous losses in the short term while working toward a long-term solution. But there were moments in the history of the Tyranids when patience gave way to something more decisive. Moments when the Hive Mind looked at a situation and concluded that what was needed was not more adaptation in the conventional sense, but the deployment of its greatest singular intelligence, its supreme tactical mind. The one entity in the entire Tyranid species that possessed something approaching genuine individual consciousness and was allowed by the Hive Mind to exercise genuine strategic discretion. The Swarmlord. To understand what the Swarmlord is, you need to understand what it represents in the broader context of Tyranid organization. The Hive Mind coordinates every Tyranid organism through synapse creatures. Those larger bioforms, hive tyrants, warriors, and their kin, that serve as relay nodes for the Hive Mind's psychic signal. Without synapse creatures nearby, lesser Tyranid organisms become uncoordinated and confused, losing the directed purpose that makes them so lethal. The synapse network is the nervous system of the swarm. It is what distinguishes a Tyranid army from a mob of large predatory animals. Hive tyrants sit at the top of this network. They are the largest, most powerful synapse creatures in standard Tyranid organization, bioengineered to embody the Hive Mind's tactical intentions on any given battlefield, capable of directing the entire swarm present with perfect coordination. They are terrifying opponents. Each one is unique, having been designed for a specific strategic purpose and equipped accordingly. But when a Hive tyrant dies, it is simply gone. Its biomass is reclaimed. Its tactical knowledge is whatever the Hive Mind was able to record, but the individual organism is finished. The Swarm Lord is different in every respect that matters. It is as old as the Tyranid race itself. It has been alive, in some form, in some body, since before the Milky Way galaxy existed in any recognizable form. And over that incomprehensible span of time, it has accumulated a depth of tactical experience that no other individual organism in the galaxy can begin to match. Every species the Tyranids have ever consumed, every empire they have ever destroyed, every brilliant military mind they have ever encountered, dissected, and defeated. The Swarm Lord remembers all of it, carries all of it, and can draw on any of it in the design of a new strategy. When the Swarm Lord dies, it is not gone. The Hive Mind retains its consciousness and reconstitutes it in a new body, not a copy, not a reconstruction from records. The actual continuous entity, transferred. When the Swarm Lord wakes in its new form, it has all the memories of everything it has experienced across eons of existence, including the memories of how it died, which it can use to ensure it does not make the same mistake again. It has been killed by Marneus Calgar, chapter master of the Ultramarines, at the Battle of Macragge. It was reborn. It has been killed by Commander Dante of the Blood Angels. It was reborn. It has been killed multiple times in engagements across centuries of warfare. Each time, it returns knowing more than it did before. There is something deeply unsettling about an opponent that simply cannot be permanently removed from the battlefield. The Swarm Lord is deployed sparingly. The Hive Mind does not use it for routine engagements, because routine engagements do not require it. It is the last resort, the option the Hive Mind reaches for when conventional synapse command structure has proven insufficient. When it appears on a battlefield, the message is unambiguous. The Hive Mind considers this fight important enough to commit its most precious weapon. At Octarius, the conventional approach had produced tremendous growth and learning, but the Orks, especially after Gazghakul's visit, were not breaking. The war could, conceivably, continue for decades more, at its current pace, grinding both sides down in a mutual attrition that was making both sides stronger rather than resolving anything. From the Hive Mind's perspective, this was not acceptable. The rest of Leviathan had other battles to fight, other worlds to consume, a larger strategic picture that required Octarius to be concluded. The Swarm Lord was spawned. Its arrival changed the character of the war immediately. Where Tyranid strategy had previously been responsive, adapting to Ork tactics as they were encountered, building towards solutions through iteration, the Swarm Lord brought something more active to the equation. It did not wait for the Orks to attack and then adapt. It designed engagements. It created conditions. It understood from thousands of years of tactical experience how to manipulate an opponent's behavior to produce the outcomes it wanted. The Swarm Lord had faced Orks before. In other conflicts, on other worlds, against other Ork warlords, it had learned how Orks think, how they respond to pressure and success and the opportunity to show off. It knew that Ork morale, for all its resilience, was tied to a sense of momentum, a conviction that the fight was going well and getting better. It knew that the way to break Ork coordination was not to meet it head-on, where Ork belligerence became an asset, but to deny it satisfaction. To create situations where the fighting was frustrating rather than glorious, where victories felt hollow because the enemy simply was not there to be beaten properly. The Swarm Lord redesigned the war around Octaria, the capital world. Rather than simply pressing the assault with maximum available force, it created a massive blockade around the planet, cutting off the flow of Ork reinforcements. It simultaneously dispatched tendrils of the fleet to strike other worlds in the sector, creating multiple simultaneous crises that the Ork command structure had to respond to, without the ability to reinforce all of them. Orok was consumed again. Resources dedicated to the push. The biomass of that world, already once processed, would feed the swarm for the final assault. At a world called Bad Squig, the Swarmlord observed that a major Ork force, led by a war boss called Stomp Krumpa and his beast Snagas, was losing momentum. Their Squigosaur mounts were dying faster than they could be replaced. Their famous beast hunting tactics were being neutralized by Tyranid organisms specifically designed to counter them. The killing rate was declining, and with it, the Orks' enthusiasm. The Swarmlord noted this and moved resources accordingly, ensuring that Stomp Krumpa's force was denied the glorious combat it needed to remain effective, turned instead toward a grinding defensive struggle that stripped away the joy of fighting until the Greenskins began to turn on each other from frustration. This was the tactical genius of the Swarmlord. It did not just fight Orks. It dismantled the psychological conditions that made Orks formidable in the first place. Part 10. The Fall of Octaria and the Death of the Overfiend. The final phase of the Octarius War converged on Octaria itself, the world at the Empire's heart, and what played out there was among the most extraordinary singular conflicts in the history of the 41st millennium. The Swarmlord had, through weeks of methodical preparation, isolated Octaria. Biofleet assets blockaded the system. The Tyranid ground forces on the surface had been built up steadily through a series of landings the Orks had not fully been able to prevent, each one small enough to fight off in isolation, but collectively establishing a presence that was now impossible to ignore. The world was encircled, its supply of reinforcements choked off, its defenders fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. But the Orks of Octaria did not despair. Despair is not really an Ork condition. What they did instead was exactly what Orks do when faced with a situation that would break a lesser species. They got angrier and they fought harder, and the new Overfiend of Octaria, whoever had claimed the title in the aftermath of Blacktooth's campaigns and the ongoing chaos of leadership succession, stood at the heart of the defense and called on every piece of loyalty and every ounce of collective belligerence the Empire could still muster. The sources are somewhat unclear on the exact identity of the Overfiend who faced the Swarmlord. The Lexiconum simply refers to him as the Overfiend of Octaria, unnamed, which is frustrating from a narrative standpoint, but perhaps fitting. In the end, what matters is not who he was, but what he represented. He was the last ruler of an empire, the inheritor of a tradition of brutal greenskin authority that had kept the Octarius sector under Ork control for longer than the Imperium chose to record. He was, by the standards of anyone who might objectively assess such things, an impressive figure. He had fought through the entire war. He had seen worlds fall and cities burn and the Tyranid tide advance and pull back and advance again. And he had not broken. On Octaria, in the final push, he led the defense personally. The Swarmlord led the assault personally. When these two entities met on the surface of Octaria, the result was one of the most savage individual engagements in the history of the conflict. The Swarmlord is, in direct physical combat, essentially unmatched. It wields 4 bone sabers, living weapons that crackle with disruptive energy, each one capable of cutting through adamantium and power fields with the ease of a blade through water. It possesses the accumulated combat experience of an entity that has been fighting for longer than the Milky Way has been stable. Every move it makes is the product of analysis accumulated over millennia. It fights like something that has already seen every possible opponent, because it has. The Overfiend was massive, as the most powerful Ork warlords inevitably become after years of unbroken combat. He would have been carrying weapons of the kind that Orks build when they have the resources of an empire at their disposal. Enormous, ungainly things by any other species' standards, but perfectly calibrated to Ork psychology and devastating in practice. He would have had every psychological advantage that an Ork leader carries into battle, the absolute certainty of his own superiority, the collective psychic backing of every Ork on the planet who could see him fighting, the momentum of a lifetime of victories that had brought him to this single point. It was not enough. The Swarmlord was what it was, and no individual Ork warlord, however formidable, had ever successfully defeated it in single combat. The Overfiend of Octaria was slain. The The Swarm Lord drove the killing blow, and with it, the last coherent military authority in the Orc Empire of Octarius was extinguished. Octaria fell. Its defenses, never dependent only on the Overfiend but certainly weakened by his death, were overwhelmed in the days that followed. The Swarm Lord coordinated the final assaults with the methodical precision that had characterized the entire campaign, and world after world in the core of the Empire was claimed by the Swarm. The digestion pools processed Octaria's populations. The bioresources fed the fleet. The Orc Empire of Octarius ceased to exist as a coherent political entity. What remained was something different, fragmented. Dozens of individual warlords, each one claiming the right to be the new Overfiend. Each one too busy fighting the others to properly coordinate resistance against the Tyranids that were still advancing through the sector. The Orc presence in Octarius was not destroyed. It was never going to be destroyed, not when the dead were feeding spore populations across hundreds of worlds. But it was broken, and breaking it had cost even the Hive Mind enormously. The Swarm Lord itself had been injured, possibly in the fight with the Overfiend. The reports are fragmentary on this point, but what is clear is that after the fall of Octaria, the pace of Tyranid advance slowed. Whether through the casualties of the final campaign, the complexities of consolidating so much territory, or some deeper consequence of having sustained losses even the Swarm Lord's resilience could not fully absorb, the momentum of the war changed in its aftermath. And there were other complications. The Octarius War had attracted attention from forces that had not been part of Kripman's original calculation. Part 11. Additional players and the wider chaos of Octarius. The Octarius War, for all that its central narrative is the clash of Orks and Tyranids, did not happen in isolation. The galaxy is not kind enough to allow a conflict of this scale to involve only the parties who started it. The Eldar, those ancient and diminished remnants of the galaxy's first great civilization, had their own reasons to pay attention to what was happening in the Octarius sector. In 997 of the 41st millennium, several Eldar war hosts entered the war, fighting against both Imperial and Orc forces in the confused edges of the conflict. The Saim Han Craftworld sent forces into the region. The Raven Guard, White Scars, and Salamander's Space Marine chapters found themselves defending embattled Imperial worlds caught in the crossfire, as the war's overflow began threatening human populations that had nothing to do with the Greenskins or the Tyranids. Chaos added another layer. The forces of the Blood God are drawn to concentrated violence, the way the Hive Mind is drawn to concentrated biomass. And the Octarius War was, by any measure, one of the most sustained and intense concentrations of violence the galaxy had seen in centuries. A World Eater's warband known as the Skull Hunt of Voda Blood Price invaded the Octarius system, lured by the spectacle of two of the most combat-capable species in the galaxy tearing each other apart. The World Eaters were, as they always are, there for the skulls. Within a single year of their arrival, over 8,000 skulls had been claimed for Khorne, the smallest of which was reportedly the size of a boulder. Their warlord, Vodaha Bloodprice, ascended to demonhood after personally slaying a Hierophant Bio-Titan, one of the largest Tyranid organisms that exists, a creature the size of a building, with a great axe recovered from the body of a slain Orc warboss called Magza da Colossus. That detail alone, Voda killing a Bio-Titan with a dead Orc's weapon, tells you something about the scale of violence that had become routine in the Octarius sector by this point. The Imperium, meanwhile, was engaged in what might charitably be called damage control. The war that was supposed to consume two of the galaxy's greatest threats had instead created a region of space so saturated with violence that it had become a danger to surrounding Imperial territories. Something needed to be done to prevent the overflow from spreading further. This was the origin of the Cordon Impenetra. The Cordon Impenetra was the Imperial designation for the containment effort that sought to establish a military perimeter around the Octarius sector, preventing the Orcs and Tyranids from spilling out into Imperial space while the war ground on. Inquisitor Sahassun, a figure who appears in the 9th edition campaign books as one of the key Imperial players in the later phase of the conflict, took a primary role in organizing this containment. Various Space Marine chapters, including a successor chapter called the Dark Krakens, were involved in establishing and maintaining the perimeter. The problem with containing a war zone of this scale is almost impossible to overstate. Space does not have walls. You cannot place a defensive line between star systems the way you can place a wall between two valleys. The distances involved are measured in light years, the conflicts happening across multiple worlds simultaneously, and the forces attempting the containment were never sufficient to actually prevent anything. They could delay. They could reinforce threatened border worlds. They could try to reduce the scale of individual breaches. But stopping the Octarius War from having consequences for its neighbors was never truly possible. What the Cordon Impenetra actually accomplished was buying time. Buying it at considerable cost in Imperial lives, but buying it nonetheless. Part 12. The Aftermath and what Octarius means for the galaxy. The fall of Octaria and the death of the last Overfiend did not end the Octarius War in any clean sense. Wars of this kind do not end. They transition. They become something new, something defined by what the conflict has made of both sides, rather than by the original conflict itself. The Orc Empire of Octarius no longer exists as a coherent entity, but Octarius as a region is still home to enormous numbers of orcs. The fragmentation that followed the Overfiend's death did not thin the greenskin population. Spores were still releasing, new generations were still emerging. The individual warlords vying to become the new Overfiend were still fighting their own wars, still growing stronger in the process, still inadvertently attracting more orcs to the sector through the psychic resonance of their conflicts. An empire had fallen, but the underlying biological process that produced that empire had not stopped operating. The Tyranid presence in the sector was also changed but not gone. The Swarm Lord had achieved its objectives, the fall of Octaria, the breaking of the Empire's command structure, but those objectives had cost enormous resources, and the Swarm needed time to consolidate. Some portion of Leviathan had been directed elsewhere during the period of the war, engaged in other campaigns across the southern galaxy. The Octarius tendril, having consumed the capital, was in a phase of digestion and recovery rather than continued advance. But the consequences of what had happened would play out across decades. The most immediate and pressing consequence was Gazg'Kul's armada. Having reinvigorated the Orc cause in Octarius, having established himself as the undisputed voice of Gork and Mork in this era, Gazg'Kul had departed with a force of followers numbering in the millions and growing. The armada he was assembling was reported at 5 million warships. 5 million. For comparison, the largest Imperial Crusade fleets in recent history had numbered in the hundreds. 5 million warships, crewed by Orks who had either been hardened in the crucible of the Octarius War or, drawn from across the galaxy by the legend of the Prophet of the Waagh, represented a military force that the Imperium had essentially no framework for confronting. Gazg'Kul's stated goal was to gather every Orc warlord in the galaxy under his command and then lead an eternal war that would never end. He was not pursuing territory or resources in the conventional sense. He was pursuing the fulfillment of a divine mandate, and that made him fundamentally different from every other Orc conqueror in history. You cannot negotiate with an entity that does not want anything you can offer. You cannot buy him off or redirect his attention. The only response to a being on a divine mission is to destroy him, and the Imperium had been trying to destroy Gazg'Kul for over a century without success. The consequences on the Tyranid side were equally alarming to Imperial scholars. The Octarius evolved Tyranid organisms, those bioforms that had developed in response to sustained conflict with Orks and been redesigned to incorporate Orc-derived biological adaptations, represented something new. Future encounters with these evolved organisms would be categorically different from encounters with standard Leviathan forces. The Tyranids that came out of Octarius were harder to kill, more aggressive, more resilient to the toxins and weapons that Imperial forces had calibrated against normal Tyranid biology. Every battle plan that had been built around known Tyranid capabilities would need to be updated. There was also the longer-term strategic question of what Leviathan would do with the genetic library it had built up through the Octarius War. The Hive Mind does not simply use acquired genetic material in the organisms immediately present. It records and integrates, making that material available for future design work across every fleet connected to the Hive Mind. This meant that the Orc-derived adaptations were not unique to the Octarius tendril. In theory, any Tyranid Hive fleet could access them, could design new organisms using the template of what Octarius had produced. The entire Leviathan fleet, spread across the galaxy, had been enriched by what happened in that one sector. The Cordon Impenetra remained in place after the fall of Octaria, though its purpose shifted. Initially designed to prevent the war from spilling out, it became more of a monitoring barrier, a way of tracking what was emerging from the former war zone and managing the response to individual breaches. Inquisitor Sahassoon's efforts in this regard were significant, though the resources available to her were never equal to the scale of what she was trying to contain. What Krypton had set in motion a decade earlier had produced results that bore almost no resemblance to his intentions. He had wanted to trigger a war of mutual annihilation. He had instead triggered a war of mutual enhancement. The Orks were bigger and more dangerous, and they had been given a focus point for the gathering of the greatest war host in their species' recent history. The Tyranids were genetically enriched with the toughest biological material the galaxy contained. The sector itself had been transformed into a wasteland of grinding violence with no clear path to resolution. And the Imperium, which had done nothing to stop Krypton's plan, which had in some ways tacitly benefited from it by not having to fight Leviathan directly for the duration, was now facing the consequences of whatever emerged from that cauldron. Krypton himself had been stripped of his rank and condemned as Extremis Diabolicus before any of this happened. He had acted alone, without sanction, using resources he did not have the authority to deploy. In the accounting of the Inquisition, his crimes were clear. But in the accounting of the galaxy, the outcome was what it was, and no amount of retrospective condemnation would change it. Part 13. The broader meaning of Octarius. There is a particular kind of tragedy that the Warhammer 40,000 universe is very good at articulating, and the Octarius War is one of the clearest examples of it. It is the tragedy of good intentions that understand the problem perfectly and solve it catastrophically. Krypton was not wrong about Leviathan. It was exactly as dangerous as he believed it to be. He was not wrong that the Imperium lacked the conventional military tools to stop it directly. He was not wrong that the Orks represented a formidable potential buffer, that the nature of their biology and their psychology made them nearly uniquely suited to sustaining combat against the Great Devourer in ways that human armies could not. The individual components of his analysis were largely sound. What he got wrong, what he could not have fully understood because no one had ever done this before, was the nature of what happened when you put these two particular species in a room together and locked the door. He thought in terms of consumption, of resources being expended on both sides until one or both were exhausted. He did not adequately account for the possibility that the conflict would be degenerative rather than consumptive, that both sides would draw strength from the fighting itself in ways that more than offset their losses. This is, in a sense, the fundamental horror of the Octarius War. It is not that the plan failed, it is that the plan worked exactly as designed. The Tyranids were redirected, the Orks were engaged, the war happened, and the result was still a catastrophe. Success, in this case, was disaster. The galaxy of the 41st millennium is full of moments like this. It is a universe so large, so complex, so full of forces that do not respond to human logic or human strategy, that even the most brilliant plans conceived by the most capable minds tend to produce outcomes that were not intended. The Eldar, with 10,000 years of strategic sophistication, make plans that backfire. The Tau, with their philosophy of the greater good, make alliances that strengthen their enemies. The Imperium, with all its vast resources and its terrible institutional memory, makes decisions at a systemic level that perpetuate the very threats it is trying to eliminate. Krypton's Gambit is simply a very clean example of this pattern, because the cause and effect are unusually traceable. One man made one decision, set one chain of events in motion, and the result was a war that reshaped the military balance of an entire sector of the galaxy. There is also something worth noting about the relationship between the two species at the heart of this conflict. Orks and Tyranids are, in a very real biological sense, perfect adversaries, not just in terms of military capability, though they are certainly matched there in ways that make the outcome of any engagement uncertain, but in terms of their fundamental nature. The Tyranids seek to consume everything that lives and use it to become more. The Orks reproduce through violence, grow stronger through combat, and exist in a state of perpetual biological pressure toward conflict. These are not two armies that happen to be enemies. These are two life philosophies that cannot coexist. Two biological imperatives that cancel each other out in the most violent possible terms. Neither side can domesticate the other. Neither side can negotiate with the other. Neither side can leave the other alone, because the Tyranids are driven to consume and the Orks are drawn to fight. When you bring them into contact, the result is inevitable and endless. This is what Kryptman understood, and what he was counting on. What he missed was that endlessness is not neutralization. Part 14, where it stands now, the unresolved war, the Octarius War, is not over. That is perhaps the most important single fact about it. The fall of Octaria was not an ending. It was a transition. The Empire is broken. The Overfiend is dead. But the Orks are still there, in enormous numbers, fighting each other and fighting the remaining Tyranid presence and growing stronger all the while. The power vacuum left by the Overfiend's death is being contested by multiple warlords, each one absorbing the other's forces through victory or threat, each one potentially the nucleus of a new power structure. Whoever eventually emerges as the dominant figure in that contest will have been tempered by years of fighting both Tyranids and rival Orks, and will command a force that is as battle-hardened as any in the galaxy. On the Tyranid side, the consolidation continues. The sector has not been fully consumed. The Ork biological presence is too diffuse and too persistent for rapid, complete digestion. But Leviathan's position in the sector is dominant in the strategic sense. The remaining Ork forces do not have the organization to threaten the Tyranid hold on the core worlds. Meanwhile, the consequences are radiating outward. The Cordon Impenetra is an ongoing effort, but the Orks are not static. Ork populations that survive the war on peripheral worlds of the sector are expanding into adjacent territories, not as part of a coordinated military campaign, but as the organic result of Ork biology doing what it always does when given enough time and enough resources. Worlds near the Octarius sector are finding Ork spore populations appearing where there were none before. Feral tribes growing in wilderness areas where no Imperial force is stationed to prevent them. The Tyranid organisms that emerge from the sector are carrying the Octarius evolved adaptations. Every encounter Imperial forces have with post-Octarius Tyranid organisms is an education in what those adaptations mean in practice. Techniques that used to work reliably against Tyranid bioforms work less reliably against these. The pattern of evolution that began in Octarius is being incorporated into the broader Hive Mind's design template. Khazgul-Khul's armada continues to grow. Reports of its progress are fragmentary and terrifying in equal measure. 5 million warships was the number given, but that number is probably already out of date. Every Ork warlord who falls before the Prophet adds forces to the mass, and the mass in turn attracts more Orks from across the galaxy, drawn by the psychic resonance of the greatest Ork gathering in living memory. The Imperium, still reeling from the formation of the Great Rift and the cascading crises of the Era Indomitus, is confronting the possibility that it faces existential threats from multiple directions simultaneously, and that its own attempt to neutralize one of those threats contributed to making several of the others worse. There is a kind of terrible poetry to this, if you are willing to look for it. Part 15. Final Reflections. A War Without a Victor. The Octarius War is one of the most remarkable conflicts in the history of Warhammer 40,000. Not because one side won and the other lost, but because the very concept of winning is difficult to apply to what happened there. The Tyranids achieved their strategic objective. The Ork Empire of Octarius was broken, its capital consumed, its leadership structure destroyed. By the metrics of Tyranid warfare, this was a success. But the cost was enormous. The timeline was measured in decades rather than years, and the genetic information acquired, while genuinely valuable to the Hive Mind's long-term designs, came with the danger that the next enemy to face those Octarius-enhanced organisms would find them considerably harder to deal with than expected. The Orks lost their empire, but Orks do not really have the kind of relationship with political entities that makes their loss meaningful in the way it would be for a human civilization. Individual Orks on individual worlds are still alive, still fighting, still growing. The spore populations are still seeding. New warlords are rising. The greatest Ork warlord in the current age just left the sector, having reinvigorated the entire greenskin war effort, and he is now accumulating a force that Imperial strategists are genuinely struggling to find a response to. Whether the Orks won or lost at Octarius depends entirely on what question you are asking. And Kryptman? He was declared extremis diabolicus, stripped of everything and cast out. In the cold assessment of the Inquisition, his crimes were severe: unauthorized destruction of a populated moon, deliberate engineering of a Tyranid invasion of an occupied sector, wholesale weaponization of an entire species without sanction. The fact that his plan produced outcomes that were not what he intended makes those outcomes his responsibility in the Inquisition's view. You do not get credit for good intentions when the result is this. But there is another way to look at it. The tendril of Leviathan that hit Octarius was a tendril that did not hit human worlds. The decades that the Octarius War consumed were decades that the Imperial worlds adjacent to the sector were not being harvested. How many lives were saved by the war that Krypton started? How many worlds continued to exist because Leviathan was occupied elsewhere? Nobody keeps that accounting because nobody can. The dead are countable. The people who did not die because the threat was redirected are invisible in the historical record. This is the moral ambiguity of the Octarius War, distilled into a single question about a single man. Was Krypton a monster or a savior? The answer depends on which deaths you count. And in a universe where every decision involves consequences at a scale that defies individual comprehension, the question may not have a clean answer. What the Octarius War does have is a lesson, and it is a lesson that the 41st millennium keeps teaching in slightly different words. There are no shortcuts. There is no move clever enough to make the fundamental horror of this universe go away. You cannot trick the Great Devourer, and you cannot domesticate the Orks, and you can't play the galaxy's worst threats against each other without feeding them. The galaxy is too large, too old, too full of forces, too alien to human understanding for that kind of strategy to work cleanly. All you can do is fight, and pay the cost, and hope that what you build in the time you buy is worth what you spent to buy it. The Orks and the Tyranids are still in Octarius, still fighting in some form, still growing, still evolving, still reshaping each other in ways that will matter for centuries to come. The war that Krypton started with a captured brood of Genestealers and a destroyed moon is ongoing, its consequences still unfolding, its final chapter still unwritten. In the grim darkness of the far future, even the endings are complicated. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, I genuinely appreciate you spending this time here. The Octarius War is one of those stories in 40K lore that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. A conflict with real thematic weight, fascinating characters on all sides, and consequences that are still playing out in the current narrative. If you have thoughts about the war, about Krypton's gamble, about whether you think the Orks or the Tyranids came out of it in better shape, or about what you think is going to happen when Khazg'Kul's 5 million warships arrive somewhere important, drop a comment and let us know. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. There is a lot more lore to explore, and every subscription genuinely helps more of this content reach people who would appreciate it. Thank you for watching. End of script, extended addendum, the full anatomy of two species at war. To truly appreciate what made the Octarius War unprecedented, it helps to spend more time with the fundamental nature of the two organisms at its center, not just their weapons and their tactics, but the deep biological and philosophical architecture that made this conflict specifically so dangerous, so generative, and so resistant to any clean conclusion. Understanding the Ork. The Ork is, among all the species that populate the Warhammer 40,000 universe, probably the most misunderstood by the humans who fight them. From the Imperial perspective, Orks are a persistent nuisance, brutal, unreliable, chaotic, a rabble that periodically coalesces into something genuinely threatening before dissolving again into factional violence. Generations of Imperial citizens grow up with an image of the Ork as a crude, stupid creature that relies on numbers and aggression to compensate for a complete lack of sophistication. This picture is accurate in some respects and dangerously misleading in others. The Orks are ancient. Their species predates the Imperium of Man by so many orders of magnitude that the comparison is almost meaningless. Current xenobiological scholarship suggests that the Orks, along with their symbiotic orkoid ecosystem, were engineered in the deep past of the galaxy by the Old Ones, a species so old that they are mythology rather than history to every living civilization. The purpose of the Orks, in the Old One's design, was to serve as a warrior race in the great wars of the ancient galaxy, specifically against the Necron tier, those skeletal machine beings who in their desperation for immortality made a pact with star-eating entities called the Citan and became the Necrons. The Orks were built to fight, to be excellent at fighting, to reproduce in conditions that would kill everything else, to spread their biological presence to every world they touched in a way that could never be fully undone. What the Old Ones created, in other words, was a self-sustaining military ecosystem, a living weapon system that did not need to be maintained, did not need to be commanded, did not need anything except a conflict to sustain itself. When the Old Ones' wars ended, when those ancient civilizations destroyed each other or were destroyed, the Orks persisted, spreading, growing, filling the ecological niche of apex predator on 1,000 worlds, forgetting their engineering origins and replacing that knowledge with a culture built entirely around the joy of fighting. That culture is more sophisticated than it appears. Ork society is not simply a mob. It has internal hierarchies that are brutally enforced, but recognizably functional. The war boss at the top, the Knobs as his lieutenants, the boys as the core fighting force, the Gretchen as the labor force, the Squigs as food animals and occasional weapons, the Snotlings tending the fungal gardens that feed everyone, the mech boys designing and building the machinery that somehow works despite violating most principles of physics, the weird boys channeling the collective psychic energy of the surrounding orcs into blasts of raw war power. Each of these roles is encoded in orc biology, not learned from experience. Mech boys do not study engineering. The knowledge is grown into them, awakening as they mature, an innate understanding of how things fit together and how to make them work that transcends whatever education a given orc has received. Weird boys are not trained psychers in the human sense. They are the nodes through which the collective psychic pressure of the orc population vents itself, and the power they access is generated by every orc in the vicinity who is feeling the particular vibration of orcish excitement and aggression. This biological determinism extends to orc physical development. Orcs do not stop growing. There is no biological ceiling that says a given orc has reached its maximum size and will develop no further. The upper limit on orc growth is simply the amount of fighting they have done, the amount of success they have achieved, and the amount of time they have had to grow. Ancient orcs who have fought continuously for centuries can reach sizes that are genuinely monstrous by any standard. Creatures that stand 3 to 4 meters tall and have bodies that are essentially covered in bone-hard natural armor, whose physical strength is sufficient to overturn a tank. The most powerful orc warlords in history have been individuals who have survived long enough to grow to these sizes, and who have combined that physical presence with the tactical acumen that only comes from having fought and won thousands of engagements. The Overfiend of Octarius, whoever held that title at any given time, would have been such an individual. The title was not inherited or elected. It was claimed through victory, and sustaining it required the continuous demonstration of the kind of power that kept every other powerful orc in the Empire from challenging for it. This is a social structure that selects aggressively for combat effectiveness, in the way that natural selection works, but compressed by the orc life cycle into something that operates much faster. There is something else about orc biology that deserves specific attention in the context of the Octarius War, and that is the spore mechanism. The orc spore reproductive system is not simply a quirky biological fact. It is a strategic reality that fundamentally alters the calculations of any war against the orcs. When an orc dies, it releases millions of spores. These spores are hardy enough to survive in soil for years, even decades. They do not need the orc that released them to survive. They simply wait. Given warmth and moisture, they begin to germinate, proceeding through the same process that produced the orc that died. First, the simplest orcoid organisms appear, squigs and snotlings. Then, as the ecosystem fills out, Gretchen. And finally, from the most mature spores and conditions of sufficient organic richness, new orcs. A world that was the site of even a single major orc battle is, in biological terms, permanently transformed. The soil of Octarius and every world in that sector was soaked in orc spores after years of sustained warfare. The Tyranids processed enormous amounts of orc biomass in their digestion pools, but they could not reach every spore. Even if they consumed every visible organism on a world, the microscopic layer of orc potential in the soil persisted. New generations would emerge. This is why the fall of the orc empire of Octarius did not and could not mean the elimination of the orcs from Octarius. The empire was gone, the orcs were not. Understanding the Tyranids represent something genuinely alien to almost every framework of understanding that evolved intelligence naturally develops. They are not a civilization. They are not, in the usual sense, even a species with individual members that matter. They are better understood as a process, a biological process operating at galactic scale, consuming and integrating everything it encounters, growing more complex and more capable with every world it devours. The hive mind is not a brain in any location. It is not a computer running somewhere that could be switched off if you found it. It is a distributed psychic consciousness emerging from the collective synaptic activity of trillions of organisms across the entirety of the swarm. Every Tyranid organism, from the smallest ripper gnawing at the bones of a battlefield to the largest Hierophant bio-titan striding through enemy battle lines, is simultaneously an independent organism and an expression of the hive mind's will. The hive mind does not simply command them, it is them, and they are it, in a way that has no real analog in any other species' relationship with collective consciousness. This architecture produces the Tyranids' most terrifying characteristic: perfect coordination at any scale. 1,000 gaunts charge in exactly the direction the hive mind wants them to charge, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right tactical intention behind the collective movement. They do not hesitate because they feel fear. They do not break because of confusion or surprise. They do not have the gaps in coordination that arise in any army where individual decision-making is involved. The swarm moves as a single organism because in a real sense it is one. Against most enemies, this is an insurmountable advantage. Human armies are limited by the speed of communication. Orders take time to relay. Situations change before responses arrive. Individual commanders make decisions that may not be perfectly aligned with the broader strategic intent. Even Space Marines, the finest human warriors the Imperium produces, are individuals with individual responses and individual fears and individual assessments of a battlefield. Against this, the Tyranid swarm has no such limitations. The hive mind sees the entire battle simultaneously and coordinates the response in real time. The shadow in the warp is the psychic phenomenon produced by a large Tyranid fleet's presence, and it is both a defensive measure and an offensive weapon. It manifests as a kind of psychic static that blankets all systems the fleet approaches, disrupting warp communication, making astropathic messages impossible to send or receive, blocking navigators' ability to pilot ships through the warp, and in extreme cases driving unprotected psychers to madness or death. A world in the shadow of a Tyranid fleet is cut off from the rest of the galaxy. No reinforcements can be reliably coordinated. No distress calls get through. The shadow turns every defensive action into a local fight against an enemy with the resources of a hive fleet, and you are fighting it alone. Against the Orks of Octarius, the shadow in the warp had a more complicated effect. Orks do not rely on astropathic communication or warp navigation in the conventional sense. Their relationship to the warp is fundamentally different from humanity's. They access it through the Wa energy that their collective psyche generates, a different frequency entirely that the shadow could disrupt but not fully suppress. The psych resonance that called Orks toward the Octarius war from across the galaxy was still getting through even in the depths of the shadow, still drawing new warriors toward the greatest fight in the sector. This was one of the specific properties of the Ork species that made them a more resilient opponent against the Tyranids than almost any other species could be. The Tyranid adaptation process deserves more detailed examination than it typically receives, because it is central to what the Octarius War meant for the Hive Fleet's long-term capabilities. The process works across multiple timescales simultaneously. In the short term, individual organisms can adjust their behavior in response to battlefield conditions in ways that suggest a kind of real-time tactical intelligence, pulling back when a position is untenable, regrouping in the dark to attack a new vector, focusing resources on identified weaknesses. This is the responsive flexibility that made the Tyranid campaign on Garala so effective against Scarfang's Orks. In the medium term, the hive mind designs new bioforms in response to persistent challenges. If standard gaunt organisms are consistently losing to a particular type of Ork weapon, the hive mind generates new variants with thicker chitin armor or with different attack profiles that approach the problem from a different angle. This takes longer than short-term behavioral adjustment, but it happens within the time span of a single campaign. Imperial tacticians who have faced the same hive fleet in successive engagements have noted that organisms they defeated convincingly in the first battle were redesigned by the second. In the long term, the genetic library of the Hive fleet expands. Every species consumed adds its biology to the pool of available genetic material. The deep archive of the Hive Mind, built over whatever incomprehensible span of time it has existed, presumably contains genetic templates from thousands of species across multiple galaxies. The Ork biological template, with its extraordinary physical resilience and its fungal-animal hybrid physiology, was a genuine addition to that archive, an addition that no amount of subsequent action by any other species could remove. This is the permanent legacy of the Octarius War on the Tyranid species. The Ork template is in the library now. It will be available to the Hive Mind's designers forever, or for whatever definition of forever applies to an entity that is effectively immortal. The specific organisms designed using that template may be destroyed. The knowledge of how to create them cannot be. The strange logic of the Octarius sector. There is a geographical and strategic context to the Octarius War that sometimes gets lost when the narrative focuses on the individual battles and characters involved. The physical location of the Octarius sector in the galaxy matters enormously to understanding why it became what it did. Octarius sits in the Ultima Segmentum, the vast eastern reach of the galaxy that is already home to some of the most contested territory in the known universe. The Maelstrom, a massive stable warp anomaly, sits not far from the sector's broader neighborhood. Ork empires have controlled this region of space for so long that the Imperium has essentially accepted their presence as a permanent feature of the local strategic environment. Occasional crusades are launched to reduce the most threatening Ork concentrations, but full elimination has never been achieved, for the reasons already discussed about Ork spore biology. The sector's position also made it an attractive target for Krypton's plan in a specific navigational sense. It sat between the advancing Tyranid tendril and the next cluster of human worlds, and the approach vector from Leviathan's general direction of travel made it a plausible destination for a diverted fleet. The destroyed moon of Geist gave the Perdition's flame just enough of a gravitational nudge to make the redirected trajectory plausible to the Hive Mind's navigation instincts, or rather, to the organic drive that directs Hive fleet movement toward the psychic signal of Genestealer infestation. The sector's size was also relevant. An Ork empire the size of Ultramar does not fall to a Tyranid fleet in weeks or months. It falls over years, and during those years, every world being contested gives the Hive fleet something to fight and digest, rather than the human worlds it would otherwise be reaching. Every year of the Octarius War was, in the calculus Krypton was working with, a year of human lives saved elsewhere. The problem is that those years also allowed both sides to become enormously stronger, and the sector's position, which made it such a useful buffer, also made the aftermath of the war particularly dangerous. Because whatever came out of Octarius, either Tyranid organisms spreading outward or Ork populations expanding into adjacent territories, was doing so from a position at the heart of the Ultima Segmentum, surrounded on multiple sides by Imperial interests. The Tyranid fleet in space, the space battles of the Octarius War, deserve more attention than they typically receive, partly because so much of the focus is on the planetary warfare, and partly because the naval dimension of the conflict is where the Hive Mind's strategic sophistication is most clearly visible. Tyranid bioships are, individually, extraordinarily capable vessels. They are living organisms of enormous size, grown from templates that the Hive Mind has been refining for millennia. They do not need the kind of extensive maintenance and crew support that mechanical warships require. They can be damaged and partially heal themselves. They can be given directions and pursue them with a degree of tactical intelligence that mechanical vessels, dependent on their crews, cannot match. They accelerate and maneuver using biological drives that have more in common with muscles than engines. And while this makes them somewhat slower in deep space transit than the fastest Imperial vessels, in the close-range combat of a fleet engagement, it gives them capabilities that no human ship can fully replicate. A Tyranid fleet in battle formation is a terrifying sight. The bioships move in coordinated patterns that would require sophisticated communication networks between mechanical ships to achieve, but that the Hive Mind coordinates instantaneously across the entire fleet. When one vessel identifies a weakness in an enemy formation, every other vessel within range knows about it and can respond before a human commander could even formulate the order to do so. The fleet fights as a single organism, because in every meaningful sense it is one. Against the Ork naval forces in Octarius, this coordination was both an advantage and a limitation. Ork ships are, in individual terms, crude by almost any standard. They are assemblages of salvaged technology, repurposed industrial equipment, and sheer brute engineering creativity, held together by the Ork belief that they will work and driven by engines that should not function, but do. They are loud, they are dirty, and they shed debris constantly. They are also extraordinarily resilient to damage, because Ork technology is built with the understanding that it will be shot at, and it is designed to keep functioning under conditions that would destroy a more precisely engineered vessel. More importantly, Ork naval tactics are informed by the same psychology that drives ground combat. Go forward, go fast, hit as hard as possible, and trust that sheer aggression will see you through. This is less strategically sophisticated than the Hive Mind's approach, but it has the advantage of being genuinely difficult to outmaneuver when the force executing it is large enough. An Ork fleet that has committed to a charge does not respond to the kind of tactical feints and positioning games that the Hive Mind excels at. It simply continues to charge, accepting losses that would break a more conventionally organized fleet, until it either wins or dies. The space battles in the Octarius War tended to be brutal and expensive for both sides, in ways that the ground war was not. In space, the Tyranid adaptive advantages were harder to apply because tactical learning during a space battle requires time that the battle itself does not provide. The Orks did not need to learn in real time in the same way. Their approach was consistent regardless of what the enemy did, which meant there was less to adapt to. At Gorala, the minefield and the gunship assault proved extremely effective precisely because the Tyranid fleet had no way to predict or respond to those specific preparations in real time. The single bioship that threw itself at the planet anyway, accepting its own destruction to deliver the payload of mycetic spores, represents the Hive Mind's answer to a tactical situation it could not resolve on its preferred terms. Sacrifice what is necessary to achieve the minimum viable outcome. This flexibility, the willingness to accept enormous losses in the service of a strategic goal, without the kind of morale consequences that would follow from such losses in a humanoid military, is perhaps the most important single characteristic that makes the Hive Mind such a difficult adversary. You cannot make it too expensive to continue the fight. You cannot cause enough damage to make it decide the objective is not worth it. It will keep coming as long as it has organisms to send, and if it runs low, it will absorb more biomass and build more. The only way to stop a Tyranid fleet is to destroy it entirely, and even then, the knowledge and genetic information it carried survives in the broader Hive Mind, the human dimension, the Imperium's watching eye. Throughout the Octarius War, the Imperium was never fully absent from the proceedings. Even if no large-scale Imperial military force participated in the central conflict, Imperial interests were involved in multiple ways, and Imperial observers were watching the war with a mixture of desperate hope and mounting dread. The Inquisition's role did not end with Kryptman's censure. Other Inquisitors took up the task of monitoring what was happening in the sector, trying to assess the developing threat from both sides and inform Imperial strategic planning. Inquisitor Sahasun, who appears in the more recent narrative expansions of the Octarius story, took on a significant portion of this work, contributing to the establishment of the Cordon Impenetra and doing her best to manage the consequences of a war she had not started but had inherited. The Space Marine chapters that were drawn into the fighting on the periphery of the sector had their own assessments of what they encountered. Reports from chapters that engaged Tyranid forces near Octarius consistently noted characteristics in the organisms they faced that did not match the established biological profiles: greater resilience, different attack patterns, unexpected armor properties. These reports were compiled, analyzed, and distributed, building toward a picture of what the Octarius War was doing to the Tyranid genome, even while the war itself was still ongoing. The Death Watch, that chamber militant of the Ordo Xenos, whose entire purpose is the elimination of alien threats, was present in various capacities throughout the conflict. Kill teams operating in the sector gathered intelligence, eliminated specific targets of tactical importance, and occasionally took actions to complicate Tyranid consolidation on worlds where the strategic balance was particularly delicate. The Death Watch's institutional knowledge of Tyranid biology and behavior was being updated constantly by the unique data coming out of Octarius. There were also the traders, the explorers, and the rogue elements that inevitably gather at the edges of any conflict large enough to create economic opportunity. Rogue traders whose operations in the Ultima Segmentum had been disrupted by the war were involved in intelligence gathering, supply running, and the kind of morally ambiguous activities that warzone economics inevitably produce. Some of them were working for the Inquisition, officially or otherwise. Some were working for themselves. Some were doing both, and hoping the distinction would never be examined too closely. The Forge world of Sigma Ulstari, featured prominently in the Warzone Octarius narrative campaign, illustrates the broader Imperial entanglement with the conflict. Forge worlds are among the most important strategic assets the Imperium possesses. Vast industrial complexes dedicated to the production of the machinery of war, from bolt pistols to battle tanks to void ship components. Sigma Ulstari was a Forge world positioned near enough to the spreading conflict to be threatened by it, and its defense became a central concern of the Imperial containment effort. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose relationship with the Imperium of Man is always complicated by their own institutional priorities, were deeply concerned about the possibility of Tyranid organisms reaching a Forge world's production infrastructure. A Forge world consumed by the Hive Fleet would not simply be a loss of territory. It would be a loss of production capability that the Imperium could not easily replace, plus the addition of all that industrial material, the metals, the plastics, the processed materials in the machines, and the infrastructure, to the Tyranid biomass pool. Sigma Ulstari was defended, at considerable cost. Multiple Space Marine chapters, various Astra Militarum regiments, and the Forge world's own Scutarii and Titan legions fought to keep it out of Tyranid hands, while simultaneously dealing with the Ork forces that had spread into the region. The war around the Forge world is a microcosm of the broader Octarius situation, a three-way fight between Orks expanding from the collapse of their empire, Tyranids consolidating their gains, and Imperial forces trying to hold a line that was never designed to be held against opponents of this size. The philosophical dimension. What it means to deploy the Swarmlord. The decision to deploy the Swarmlord at Octarius tells us something important about how the Hive Mind assessed the strategic value of the conflict. The Swarmlord, as established earlier, is not a routine deployment. It is the last resort, the measure the Hive Mind reaches for when conventional approaches have proven insufficient. The fact that the Octarius War eventually required the Swarmlord's presence is an implicit acknowledgement that the Orks of Octarius, enhanced by years of warfare and reinvigorated by Gazgakul's visit, were posing a genuine strategic challenge that the Hive Mind's standard tactical solutions could not resolve on an acceptable timeline. This is remarkable. Hive Fleet Leviathan had by this point consumed entire sectors of the galaxy. It had devoured Space Marine homeworlds and broken Imperial Crusade fleets and reduced civilizations to bare rock. For any single military force to hold out long enough to require the Hive Mind's supreme tactical intelligence to be deployed against them represents an extraordinary achievement, regardless of the final outcome. The Swarmlord's approach at Octaria also represents a shift in Tyranid strategic philosophy that the Imperial observers recording the campaign found deeply troubling. Prior Tyranid campaigns had typically relied on mass and adaptation, overwhelming force, combined with the capacity to evolve organisms that specifically countered whatever defensive adaptations the defenders developed. The Swarmlord at Octaria operated more selectively, more deliberately, more like a chess player than like a force of nature. The blockade, the simultaneous peripheral attacks to draw resources away from the main theater, the patient siege of the capital world rather than the direct overwhelming assault. These were techniques that bore the hallmarks of individual strategic genius rather than the distributed optimization of the Hive Mind's usual approach. What this suggests is that even the Hive Mind, with all its distributed intelligence, has different modes of operation. The standard mode is the one that consumes most worlds, vast and terrible, but fundamentally mechanical in its application of force to resistance. The Swarmlord mode is something more dangerous, more adaptive at the individual decision level, more capable of the kind of creative problem-solving that confounds opponents who have calibrated their defenses against the standard approach. For the Orks, who had adapted their tactics to the standard Tyranid approach through years of experience, the shift that the Swarmlord represented was genuinely destabilizing. They knew how to fight the Swarm when the Swarm came at them directly. They had developed, through painful experience, a sense of how Tyranid organisms behaved and how to exploit the gaps in Tyranid coordination that distance from synapse creatures created. The Swarm Lord closed those gaps. It brought a level of tight coordination and strategic creativity to the Tyranid forces that the Orks had never faced before, and their response to it, continuing to fight with the straightforward aggression that had served them well before, was less effective than it needed to be. This is the tactical tragedy of the Ork Empire's final defense. They had become very good at fighting the Tyranids as they had learned to expect them, and then the Tyranids sent something they had never learned to expect. The question of Cryptman's legacy. In the decades since the Octarius War began, the question of how to assess Inquisitor Cryptman has been debated in whatever forms within the Inquisition still permit such discussions. It is not a simple question, and the fact that it is not simple is itself revealing. The orthodox position within the Inquisition is clear. Cryptman acted beyond his authority, caused enormous harm through the destruction of Geist's moon, and the deliberate engineering of an alien invasion of an inhabited sector, and the fact that this produced net benefit for certain human populations in the short term does not retroactively sanction either the method or the decision-making process. The Inquisition does not function if individual inquisitors can make decisions of this magnitude unilaterally. The rule is the rule. The unorthodox position, held quietly by more people than would admit it publicly, is that the Inquisition's handling of the Tyranid threat at the time of Leviathan's arrival was inadequate, that Cryptman understood the scale of the problem better than any of the institutional structures arrayed around him, and that his decision, while undeniably extreme, bought the Imperium time it desperately needed. The destruction of Geist's moon was a crime, but how many moons' worth of lives were saved by diverting Leviathan's approach into a region that could resist it? The third position, held by people who find both previous views too simple, is that the Octarius War proves neither that Cryptman was right nor that he was wrong, but that the galaxy is simply too large and too complex for any individual actor's decisions to have predictable outcomes at the strategic scale he was attempting to operate at. He was not wrong to try. He was not right in what he expected the outcome to be. He was a human being making the best decision he could with the information he had, and the result was both better and worse than he expected, in ways that will continue to unfold for generations. This third view has the advantage of being honest about the limits of individual human intelligence when confronted with galactic-scale problems. It is also the view that is most useful going forward, because it emphasizes the importance of continued monitoring, adjustment, and response to a situation whose consequences are still developing. Cryptman himself was last reliably reported collaborating with Deathwatch forces on plans related to the mysterious Hive Fleet Tiamat, which appears to be constructing something on the world of Xyophoria, the nature of which remains unknown. He has not given up on the Tyranids as a problem to be solved. Whatever that says about him as a person, it says something accurate about the Tyranid threat. It continues, and it does not wait for the galaxy to process its feelings about the people who have dedicated themselves to understanding it. Addendum. The World Eaters at Octarius and what their presence means. The arrival of Vodeha Bloodprice and the skull hunt of the World Eaters at Octarius is a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives, because their presence reveals something important about the broader dynamics of the 40th Millennium galaxy. The World Eaters are a traitor legion, one of the original Space Marine legions that turned against the Emperor 10,000 years ago in the great catastrophe known as the Horus Heresy. Once the Warhounds, a legion known for controlled aggression and tactical excellence, they were transformed by the corrupting influence of the blood god Khorne into something categorically different. Warriors whose capacity for martial violence has been amplified to the point of consuming all other aspects of their personality. They live to kill. They fight to offer skulls to their patron deity. They have no other meaningful agenda. The fact that Khornate forces were drawn to Octarius is not surprising. A sustained conflict of this magnitude, producing deaths in numbers that beggar imagination across dozens of worlds, generates exactly the kind of spiritual resonance in the warp that attracts servants of Khorne like predators to blood. What is interesting is the scale of what Voda Bloodprice achieved in a single year. 8,000 skulls, the smallest the size of a boulder. 8,000 kills, each one representing an organism large enough to produce a skull of that size, means 8,000 engagements with Tyranid or Ork organisms of significant size, in a single year. This tells you something about the density of combat in the Octarius sector at the height of the war. It was not simply that large armies were present on multiple worlds. It was that combat was so continuous, so omnipresent, so saturating every surface and tunnel and orbit of the sector that a relatively small warband could find 8,000 worthy opponents within a year simply by going where the fighting was loudest and following it. Vodha's ascension to demonhood, that transformation into a true demon prince that represents the greatest reward Khorne can bestow on a servant who has proven themselves sufficiently devoted to martial excellence, was achieved through the killing of a Hierophant bio-titan. Hierophants are among the largest Tyranid organisms that exist in the lore, bio-titans in the true sense, creatures that stand as tall as a building and are used as living siege engines against the heaviest fortifications. Killing one in personal combat, with a weapon made from the great axe of a slain orc war boss, is either an act of extraordinary individual power or an act of extraordinary Khornate favor, or, more likely, both. The Blood God's patronage has a way of amplifying the martial capabilities of those who have genuinely earned his attention. The World Eater's presence in Octarius was not strategically meaningful in the sense of shifting the balance between Orks and Tyranids. They were not there to help either side or to conquer the sector. They were there for the fight itself, and the gifts the fight gave them. But their presence is a reminder that the galaxy does not stop happening while any one conflict is going on. Chaos does not pause its machinations, because two other enormous threats are busy consuming each other. The warp does not take a holiday from producing horrors while everyone else deals with their own problems. Everything is happening simultaneously, always, and the Octarius War existed in that context. On the concept of the Great Wog and what it portends, the psychic phenomenon that Orks call the Great Wog deserves careful examination in the context of Octarius, because what Gazgakul is assembling represents something that has not existed in the galaxy's recent history. In Ork cosmology, Gork and Mork are twin gods, representing two complementary aspects of Orkish existence. Gork is brutal but cunning. Mork is cunning but brutal. The distinction matters to Orks in a way that is somewhat difficult for outsiders to parse. But the rough summary is that Gork is the god of straightforward, overwhelming force, and Mork is the god of sneaky, outflanking, devastating force. They are worshipped not through ritual or prayer in the conventional sense, but through the practice of war, and their favor is expressed through the fortunes of battle. The Great Wog is, in Ork belief, the war that the gods themselves are pushing history toward, a final, eternal conflict of overwhelming scale, in which every Ork in the galaxy participates simultaneously. This is not metaphor for the Orks. They genuinely believe this is where history is going, and Gazgakul, as the prophet, is the instrument through whom Gork and Mork are making it happen. Whether this belief has actual theological validity in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, whether Gork and Mork are real entities in the warp who are genuinely guiding Gazgakul toward a divine purpose, is characteristically, deliberately ambiguous. The Ork warp gods are real in some sense, because the collective psychic energy of billions of Orks generates something in the immaterium that manifests as divine will. Whether that manifested will has the agency and intention that Orks believe it has, or whether it is simply the emergent property of billions of minds collectively dreaming of war, is a question the setting does not definitively answer. What is not ambiguous is the military reality of what Gazgakul is assembling. An armada of 5 million warships is not a metaphor. It is a fact that has Imperial naval planners updating their strategic projections in ways that most of them find alarming. 5 million warships filled with Orks who have either been directly tempered in the Octarius War or drawn from across the galaxy by the legend of it. Battle-hardened, enormous from years of fighting, fired up with the conviction that a divine mandate is behind them, is a military force of a type and scale the Imperium has no direct historical precedent for defending against. When this force arrives wherever Gazgakul points it, the Octarius War will have produced a secondary catastrophe larger than itself. The war that Kryptman started to save human lives from the Tyranids will have been, in part, the crucible in which the greatest Ork war host in the recent galaxy was forged. This is the final terrible irony of the Octarius War. It did not contain the threats to the Imperium. It concentrated them, refined them, and sent them out into the galaxy wearing armor that nothing in the original equation had accounted for. If you have made it all the way through this extended dive into the Octarius War, You have now covered everything from Cryptman's earliest encounters with the Tyranids to the last echoes of the war in the era Indomitus. This is one of those stories that rewards deep engagement. The more you look at it, the more layers there are, and the more implications you find that circle back to the broader narrative of what is happening to the galaxy as the 41st millennium becomes the 42nd. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? What part of the Octarius story do you find most compelling? And if you enjoyed this content, subscribing is the single best thing you can do to help more of it reach people who would appreciate it. Every subscriber genuinely matters. Thank you, and see you in the next one.